Hey, Walter Sorrells back again with more tips for the knife maker. I'm following up in this video on an earlier video that I did about how to photograph knives. Now, the earlier video talked mostly about how to photograph Western type knives. Now, as it happens, I make knives in the more Japanese style. And there are actually some subtleties about how to photograph Japanese knives that are quite different from typical Western knives. So what we're going to talk about today is the differences and how to take pictures, good pictures of Japanese swords. So this might be of use to you even if you don't make Japanese swords, if you're a sword connoisseur or somebody who's selling swords on the internet, whatever. This will show you how you can take better pictures of Japanese style blades. So one last note is you might want to check out my earlier video because that one goes over some of the details of preliminary things about how to use your camera and various setup issues that I'm not going to cover here. Alright, well let's launch into it. Knives and swords are intrinsically difficult to photograph. Why? Well, when you look at a chicken, you see a chicken. When you look at a mirror, though, you see whatever's reflected in the mirror. A steel blade is more like a mirror than a chicken, so it reflects whatever's behind it. In order to effectively get around this problem, we have to be photographically creative, because we're taking a picture of the blade, not the stuff in your room. In one of my previous videos, I showed how to photograph Western knives. With Western knives, you want to nullify the appearance of distracting reflections by reflecting broad swaths of light which make the blade appear smooth and featureless. But in Japanese blades, this approach just won't hack it. We want to reveal all the activities in the blade, the hamon, the hada, and so on. So this takes a completely different photographic strategy. Again, I'd reiterate that it's worth watching the other video before you watch this one just to give you some general guidelines on shooting knives. How to use your camera, how to set white balance and things of that nature, shooting from a tripod, so on. That said, the basis of my photographic approach to shooting Japanese blades is using a very dark room so that no reflections whatsoever are picked up in the blade. I shoot in my workshop, which has all the windows blacked out. A basement's another good choice. Now, if you don't have access to any room that can't be rendered extremely dark, I'd recommend shooting at night. If you don't, you're likely to pick up stray reflections that will compromise the quality of your pictures. And whatever you do, don't shoot outside during the day. In this video, I'm going to be shooting a sword that I made. Now, I make three basic kinds of swords, more or less traditionally made blades forged from tamahagane, blades forged from folded modern steel, and blades forged from unfolded modern steel. This particular sword is more of a martial arts type functional blade, so it's made from unfolded steel. This means that it has no hada or grain pattern. It just happened to be the blade that I had on hand when I was making the video. But the photographic principles used here would absolutely be identical even if it were a Nihonto. Okay, first let's talk cameras. I'm shooting a relatively inexpensive Nikon digital SLR with an El Cheapo 85-50 kit zoom lens. You can of course shoot much more expensive cameras with fancy prime lenses and so forth, but more importantly, you can also do most of what I do here with moderately priced point-and-shoot cameras. Okay, the first rule of photographing Japanese blades is that you gotta turn your flash off. As I said ad nauseum in my last video, I always shoot on the manual setting of my camera. This allows me to control everything. Basically, a mirror fools your camera. But you're smarter than your camera, so the blade won't fool you, and that's why you shoot manual. Control everything, and you'll get the shot right. Hand over control to your stupid camera, and about 10 things will go wrong immediately. Next thing, I put the camera on a tripod. You're probably going to end up shooting at very slow shutter speeds, so you want a tripod to stabilize the camera. If you don't, you'll end up with blurry pictures. I also set the camera on timed mode so that I can press the trigger, then take my hand off the camera. That way my fingers aren't causing the camera to shake. Again, the goal is a really crisp, well-focused photograph. Okay, so here's my basic setup. I start by putting the blade on a stand. My stand's designed for photographing, so it's slightly different from a normal Japanese sword stand in that it doesn't have deep pockets to keep the blade from falling over. This reveals a little more of the blade for photographic purposes, but otherwise it's just a pretty normal sword stand. I also like to put some kind of dark, neutral background behind my blade. A photographer's backdrop, seamless paper, black foam core board, all of those are good. The darker the better. Now I come to the single most important thing, light. Lighting is about 80% of photography, so this is where you have to get it right. I said it before, but I'll say it again. Turn off that flash. The mirror that is your blade will throw that flash back in your face, blowing out the middle of your blade. That's bad. Don't do it. Control all the light yourself. The camera's dumb, you're smart. Don't let that camera be trying to tell you how to take pictures. So, here's a basic diagram of how I light the blade. Very simple, just two lights. I don't use fancy photographic lights, just simple clamp lights or halogen work lights. In this case, I'll be running 500 watt halogen work lamps. Because these are classified as incandescent lights, I want to set my white balance on the camera for incandescent. You can go auto if you want, but again, the camera may not get it right, and if it doesn't, your photos are liable to come out with a yellowish cast. I set my camera on the tripod slightly higher than the blade. Because the blade naturally leans back a little bit in the stand, I'm basically now shooting perpendicular to the blade. I want to use as much telephoto as I can. The further back I get, the less optical distortion there is, which makes the blade look funny. Now I usually put my light just a little bit above the plane of the blade. What you're basically doing here is balancing even, powerful lighting against nasty reflection. The closer your lights are to the center of the blade, the evener the light, but the nastier the reflection. If you have enough space in your room, pull those lights back a little bit from the blade, and that way the center of the blade will be closer to the light value of the ends of the blade. In my world, I just settle for a little bit of ugly reflection on the Kissaki and a little bit of light sag toward the middle of the blade. Incidentally, in an upcoming video, I'll show some Photoshop tricks for minimizing the fact that the center of the blade is darker than the ends when you use this setup. So, that's it, your basic setup. Two lights, dark room. Recognize that every blade is different, so you want to experiment. Move the lights around. Sometimes the light may pick up the hamon at the expense of the hada, or vice versa. You may get some reflections from a window or a shiny object in the room. Or one part of the blade may look good while the other, not so much. Just fart around until you've found something that you're reasonably happy with. Once I get my blade looking good to my eye, I'll start shooting. I want my ISO set as low as possible and my aperture open as wide as possible. Pay super close attention to focus. This is critical. I recommend switching off the autofocus and focusing manually if your camera will allow you to do that. Then zoom in on the monitor to make sure the blade is super crisp. Once I've got my focus, then I start worrying about correct exposure. I start by seeing what the light meter inside the camera tells me. Do I trust it? Hell no. It'll always be wrong because when you're shooting blades, it gets fooled by the dark background. You smart, camera dumb, remember? So, what I do is start with that original exposure, then I bracket the exposure, meaning that I take whatever the camera says, and I shoot one shot there, then I take several shots at progressively faster shutter speeds, and then several at progressively slower speeds. Then, when I go to my photo processing program later, I'll have a bunch of images to choose from. One of them will be right. Shoot and shoot and shoot. Electrons are cheap. So that's basically it for the main shot. Then I just reverse the blade and shoot the other side. Once I'm done, I'll reposition my tripod closer to the blade and shoot close-ups of the features of the blade. With this particular lens, I can get fairly close, but if you want to, you can buy little screw-on close-up macro lenses that will get you even closer to the blade. I want to shoot just off axis, in other words, not straight towards the blade. I want to angle it off a little bit towards the direction of my light source. There are two reasons for this. First, if I shoot straight on, I'll end up with reflections of me and the camera and the tripod in the blade. That obscures features of the blade. Also, the hamon in particular shows up more vividly when you're shooting toward the light. Pick out the most striking activities of the blade and experiment until you get them to really pop. In this case, for instance, I made an image of Mount Fuji in the hamon, so I want to make sure that I get a good shot of that. Again, bracket the exposure and shoot a ton. The Kissaki can be a challenge because it picks up your light and tends to get blown out, so reposition the lights if you have to when you're shooting close-ups. If you're shooting an antique blade, of course, you want to shoot nice clear shots of the Nakago on both sides. This isn't especially hard to do, but obviously you want to make sure that you pick up every chisel stroke of the Mei along with any other features like arsenal stamps, imperial markings, etc. As I said, this is a newly made blade. Here are some examples of other kinds of blades. This one I forged from tamahagane, so it has a very different appearance. And this one is folded steel, but made from modern steel rather than tamahagane. Different appearances, but photographically I use the same techniques on all of them. Hope you're enjoying this series of videos. If you did, check out my website, waltersorrellsblades.com, where you'll find lots more videos in this vein, along with plenty of examples of my own work. Also, like my page, Walter Sorrells Blades, on Facebook. Thanks for watching.